brands in the last few decades have kind of embraced this archetypal thinking as a way to think about their brand identity. Are we a hero brand? Are we a lover brand? Are we a caregiver brand? So they're not unfamiliar with the idea of using archetypes as a way to tease out brand values, brand meaning, brand perception. And I started to think about this from a sonic perspective. Are there ways in which, we know that music has an impact on our emotions and our physiology. I wondered if music might actually have an impact on our perception of meaning.
Welcome to Audio Branding, the hidden gem of marketing. I'm your host, Jody Krangle, and this podcast will discuss just how sound influences our behavior. I generally talk about this in the context of advertising and marketing, but there are other places this is important too. I really feel that it plays a much more important role in our lives than maybe we realize. So let's delve a little deeper. This is the second part of my interview with Steve Keller. Well, speaking of academia, I know you've also done a white paper on understanding how sound can affect the healthcare industry. So can you talk a little bit about that and where maybe that's heading?
Yes, sure. So that particular paper that you're talking about was published this past October in the Journal of Music and Medicine. And it's a piece of research that I did with Charles Spence from Oxford. And what we did was basically a pretty thorough literature review looking at the impact of music, soundscapes, and noise on the healthcare vertical. Mm-hmm. And more specifically, the potential impact on patient experience. So what we argued in the paper was there's a plethora of research that shows the power of music and soundscapes to impact health outcomes and really help treatment at all kinds of different levels within the healthcare system. We also kind of discussed the impact of noise and the negative impacts of that.
Well, I know it affects even the doctors and nurses that are in the same environment. So
certainly, I mean, one of the things that we talked about was the use of music in the operating theater, if you will, and positive benefits, but also some cautionary tales around that. But what to me was a little interesting about the paper was a pivot that we took, where we couched this in the context of the experience economy, if you will. And we talk about that a lot now, where brands, the differentiator isn't just the product itself, it's a consumer experience of that product. And as healthcare and hospitality, if you will, intersect, there's a lot more emphasis on the patient experience or the consumer experience, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so we looked at the impact of music, soundscapes, and noise, not just on health-related outcomes, but also on the patient experience, patient satisfaction, and how that can play into a financial bottom line from a marketing perspective.
Well, if clients are happier, I guess they get more funding, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
and that was the way we closed the paper. We were saying, look, there's enough evidence to say you should be exploring the power of sound as part of the healthcare process, just from the positive effects on patient outcomes. Mm-hmm. But we're smart enough to know that there are also CFOs and CROs and marketers.
And it has to do with money. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this is an argument for that particular part of the C-suite, mm-hmm. to say, look, the outcome should be enough to say we should be looking at this and using it more. But let's just draw the line straight to revenue. And so that the impact of this on the patient experience draws into that as well. So here's a secondary argument to get you to begin thinking more about the environment, about alarm fatigue, about the way that sound is impacting the health caregivers as well as those who are receiving the health care. We tied it in even to things we spoke a little bit earlier about sound and taste, but you think about nutrition in a healthcare environment. You're a diabetic. If we need to cut sweetness out, could we come up with a playlist that might put that sweetness back into your flavor perception, and give you a more pleasant relationship there to your eating experience? But we've also found that things around volume and cross-modal congruency with food can have an impact on how much people eat. And so if you need to increase the caloric intake, what are some things you can do sonically to have an impact there? Or even on choices of food, because there's been some research around healthy choices in food that are tied to specific kinds of soundscapes or playlist choices. So again, these are areas that we're just beginning to scratch the surface, but beginning to realize that we can have a huge impact on behavior, thinking about it from a sonic perspective.
Sure. We had talked about psychophysics. Is that what this kind of thing is, or is that completely different?
No, it's all tied together.
Okay, as it should be.
So psychophysics, psychophysics is basically a branch of psychology, if you will, that takes a look at how our perception of reality is a combination of sensory input.
Okay.
So what we see, what we taste, what we hear, what we touch, what we smell, all of those things are combined in a way that helps us interpret the world around us. So psychophysics is the study of how this works. And cross-modalism, which is, again, kind of a different, even deeper branch of psychophysics, again, looks at how our modalities or our sense modalities can be crossed. And so, how can what we see impact what we hear? How can what we hear impact what we see, or our perception of smell, or even texture? So I focus more on looking at things through the lens of sound, and how we can use sound to affect our other senses, whether it be what we taste or what we see or what we touch. And that's, again, from a psychology standpoint, kind of leads to another area of emphasis for me, which is around archetypes.
Yes, and I was going to ask you about that as well, because I know that there are archetypes in story, but are there the same archetypes in sound?
Yeah, and that's the question. And the arc of my own journey around archetypes is that, again, drawing back on my interest in psychology, one of the psychologists that I really enjoyed researching in my early days of study was Carl Jung, who noticed in mythologies around the world it didn't matter about the culture, it didn't matter historically in time when these stories developed. There are very similar themes and characters in the narrative. And so he began to catalog these, the jester, the hero, the rebel, the caregiver, the lover, into these archetypes that he called them, these symbols. And so brands in the last few decades have kind of embraced this archetypal thinking as a way to think about their brand identity. Are we a hero brand? Are we a lover brand? Are we a caregiver brand? So they're not unfamiliar with the idea of using archetypes as a way to tease out brand values, brand meaning, brand perception. And I started to think about this from a sonic perspective. Are there ways in which, we know that music has an impact on our emotions and our physiology. I wondered if music might actually have an impact on our perception of meaning, and how we're interpreting a particular narrative.
And is that the same across all cultures? I mean, because,
Right.
different places
Yeah,
in
exactly.
the world.
I mean, there's been a lot of interesting research, particularly of late, in the universality of music, and there's a lot of interesting debate within the small circles around, is it accurate to call music a universal language? Most of the scientific community would say no, that's kind of a misnomer. But what we have found is that there are similarities where we could play pieces of music from cultures that you and I are not a part of, that might use a language that's totally unfamiliar to you and I, but we could perceive the particular piece of music we're listening to as being that's around dance, or that's around lullaby, or that's around love.
Or even just the emotion that it induces.
Yes. So there are these kind of universal emotional experiences. And again, I want to be careful to say that, there are differences. So this isn't an across the board, what's sad in one culture sounds exactly sad in another. But
sure.
It's much more consistent than language. When we're dealing with words or text or even brand names, we're often thinking about, well, what happens when we translate that name into another language? Does it carry another level of meaning that maybe we're not aware of as a native speaker?
So maybe it's easier as a brand to use audio to
Exactly.
be more perceived across
Exactly.
a broad spectrum of places.
Right.
Yeah.
Because when I hear ba-dum-bum-bum-ba anywhere in the world,
yeah,
I know that's
what it is.
McDonald's.
Yeah.
I don't have to see the text or even the golden arches. So when we think about these archetypes, and I started thinking about how to apply this in helping brands build sonic profiles. And again, we're used to talking about language, so very often, as a composer or even as a voice talent, you get briefs where you need to sound happy. You need to sound playful. You should sound confident. Whatever these emotional adjectives are that we use, and yet without a context, that might be interpreted in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what archetypes do is they give us a context, because happy to a lover could sound very different than happy to a jester or happy to a ruler.
Yeah, I know, for instance, that when I'm given a piece of music to speak to as a voice talent, it's a lot easier for me to figure out where I need to go as far as emotion is concerned.
Sure. Yeah, because you're drawing on the cues from that musical narrative, if you will.
Exactly. Yeah,
and so
it so helps.
Yeah, and so in cinema, we use this all the time. I mean, there are certain places that we go, certain sound, the building blocks of sound, like tempo or pitch or timbre or harmony or dissonance or major or minor keys, that we draw on to, introduce the villain, or to introduce the hero or to introduce the lover.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to do some research. I get to a point where, I call myself an audio alchemist, because it's always this balance between sound science and sound art and blending these things together. And so I got to a point where I was seeing the benefits, but then the scientist in me was taking over and saying, well, I mean, is this does this really exist?
Mm-hmm.
So we did a piece of research where we went to composers. We gave them a series of narratives that were kind of built around different archetypal characters. And then we asked them questions kind of tied to these building blocks of tempo, of rhythm, of pitch, of harmony, of modality, and asked them, how much of this versus that would they use, kind of the sonic ingredients to build the lover cake or the hero cake or the sage cake.
Okay.
Then we looked for correlations. So that was the first piece. So, as we were doing that piece of the research, I'm thinking, okay, I'm either going to find out now whether this is brilliance or BS. I don't often know. And so what we found was we saw some clustering, some correlations around the particular archetypes we were looking for that suggested that this group of composers from a variety of backgrounds, were drawing from the same well. And we weren't asking why. Is it because this is something kind of internal and innate that's part of our evolution? Or is it just that Western cinema has so pervaded our perceptions musically that that's what's happening? So we didn't look at the why. We just wanted to see if it existed. And so then the second step in the experiment was I worked with a company, License Lab, that I've used to draw a lot from for licensing. They gave us access to their entire library. We wanted to use pieces of music that people wouldn't be familiar with. It didn't have words, so there weren't semiotic language cues, and used algorithms that were based on these decisions that the composers were made to kind of analyze these pieces of music based on tempo, rhythm, modality, pitch, the things that we looked at, and let the algorithm choose.
Mm-hmm.
What was the lover? What was the sage? What was the jester? Those were the three that we were looking at specifically. And then after those choices were made, we played those for a general population of listeners. And what we found was that the listeners had similar areas of correlation. So the idea is composers, wherever they're drawing from, they draw from this and can encode this information into a piece of music, and a listener can then decode that information. And so kind of bringing all this heady science more to a practical point, when we think about brands, how are brands using music and sound to create a narrative that's congruent with whatever the archetypal perception is of the brand? And we took this a step further and took a piece of advertising, a television commercial, and changed the piece of music, the soundtrack, underneath that commercial. And so one of the pieces, drew from the research that this is more of a jester piece of music. Here's a piece that's more hero. Here's a piece that's more lover. Here's a piece that's more rebel. And then we went into a lab and we used software to look at eye tracking, where people were looking as they were watching the commercial, and then heart rate and brainwave activity to look at arousal, to look at cognitive load, how hard their brain was working, and also looking at appeal as another metric. And what we found was simply by changing the soundtrack, we could change where people were looking, what their focus was, their state of arousal, how hard their brain was working, and we found that cross-modally or archetypally congruent tracks tended to have the brain working less hard. It just made sense because it was kind of fitting with the archetype.
Yeah.
And was much more appealing. So again, we're moving beyond just emotion. And when brands understand, they're not just telling an emotional story, but they're creating a narrative that is having an impact on how the consumer is interpreting the story. So it just gives more credence to the fact that we need to be much more intentional in our choices.
Yeah, definitely. It's really fascinating research. So is that what you've been working on now, or was that previous?
Well, the archetypal piece is still ongoing. In fact, that particular piece of research is in academic review, so we're working on a few revisions to get that through the reviewer piece of this, and hopefully, to see it published in the months ahead. But there is some ongoing research that we're doing here at Pandora, and I think the realities are, again, we're just scratching the surface with this. Prior to our piece of research, which I did with Goldsmiths University out of London, Christian Wong was a student there that I was working with, and Daniel Muhlensiefen heads up the Music, Mind, and Brain program at Goldsmiths. And what we found in our literature review was that while there was a lot of anecdotal evidence, and that's certainly, not an unfamiliar idea to think that there might be a relationship between archetypes and musical narratives, there had never been any really empirical research. So this is groundbreaking in that sense. Then the bigger questions are, if this is indeed happening, if we can repeat these results, why is it happening? Or, when we start looking at different cultures, because most of the individuals in our sample were probably more from a Western mindset. If we look at an Eastern mindset, do we see similarities? Are they true archetypes in a Jungian sense? So there's that piece of it, and my hope is that maybe we could tease enough of this out that we could get to a point where algorithmically we could analyze a piece of music and say, here are the archetypes that are present, and if I wanted to put a playlist together that taps into the hero archetype, here's what I can do. If I want to tap into the lover archetype, here's what I can do. Or if I want to have a hero lover, here's what I can do.
Yeah.
So those are the future pieces.
Okay, so I'm curious now as to where you think this is all headed in the general sense of audio branding. Just like, what do you think the future of this could be?
Well, I think the future goes back to this idea of just becoming more intentional with our choices around sound and making more educated choices. And I'm quick to say that, while a lot of what we've talked about has really been about the science of sound, there is an art there.
Definitely, yeah.
And I come from that background myself as an artist, as a composer, as a creator. And I understand the tension that can exist there. And I think sometimes we think of science and art as two opposite ends of a spectrum, as opposed to two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
And so while as an artist, I might like to believe in a mystical concept of a muse that I'm somehow channeling and I just become a vessel through which this flows. To me, it's no less magical to think that there is a way that our brains work and that we perceive the world. And if I can understand how to connect those dots, that there's an outcome that seems just as transcendent. And so I think ultimately where this is headed is for brands to understand, first and foremost, that sound moves us, and that piece they already get. There's not a question around that, but
Sure.
more than moving us, there's a meaning that comes from those choices. But then also, accepting the fact that there's a value perception gap that exists, because even though we understand and believe and give what I call intellectual assent to the power of sound, we don't treat it as if it's all that important.
Mm-hmm.
A very small part of our budgets in marketing and advertising are dedicated to it. Certainly, we've done the work to develop these brand books that have very thorough visual style guides and copy, and we talk about tone of voice, and we don't talk about that sonically. It usually is the tone, quote unquote, that we're adapting in our copy. But we need to take that same kind of energy and devotion to our visual branding and apply that to sonic branding as well. So we need to kind of close this value perception gap of understanding and believing the power of sound, but really in our behavior towards it, treating it as if it's not that important, thinking about it at the very end of the process than at the beginning. I would wrap all of this up by saying that what we really need to turn our attention to is, how are we making these choices, and how are we measuring the outcomes. So with a lot of our clients, I talk about these, I call them the three pillars, if you will, of return on sonic investment.
Mm-hmm.
And one is engagement. That's how we're used to using sound all the time. How are we capturing somebody's attention?
Sure.
How are we creating an emotional connection? And engagement for me has to be tied to a behavioral outcome. Otherwise, it's really a meaningless metric. We talk about engagement a lot in marketing, and yet there's no motivation or behavior that comes on the other end of that. And so we measure things that aren't really that useful. So we should be thinking about what's a behavioral outcome for sound, and then what's our key performance indicator around that, and how are we measuring that? So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is identity. So not only can we influence behavior, we can influence perception. So how are we using sound to build into a long-term identity for the brand, into a recognition, into whatever the perception of the brand values and meaning and attributes are. So what's our KPI around perception, and how are we measuring that? And then the final pillar is management. So if we begin thinking about sound in terms of not just how it's engaging our audience and behaviors around that, and not just in terms of how it's driving perception and measuring the outcomes around that, but now how are we managing essentially a sonic system that we're building, and how are we measuring equity there? And I'm talking not just about long-term brand equity. How are we building brand linkage? How are we having an impact on purchase intent or willingness to pay, or brand attribution, but also realizing that very many of these audio assets that we create are quite literally intangible assets. And I'm talking about copyrights.
Mm-hmm.
And if brands begin to understand the value of a copyright, which gets lost in work for hire language, when they realize they have an intangible asset they can collateralize and that can generate revenue, there's another way they can see returns. And I think that does two things. I think it helps the brand understand, the value of music and sound from an IP perspective. But I think it also helps us talk about the value and fair payment, if you will, to the content creators.
Sure.
And what's the cost, not simply for creating an asset, but for acquiring a copyright that over time, if it's managed correctly, will simply increase in value. So if brands are looking at identity, perception, equity, if they have KPIs and are measuring outcomes here, it will have a snowball effect all the way back to the point of asking questions about why are we choosing this piece of music? Why are we choosing this voiceover? And how is it going to impact behavior, perception, and brand equity? To me, that's the ultimate frontier, where we're not as buttoned up in those three areas as we need to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, my mind is blown.
Yeah, well, I know. I mean, talking to me is like trying to get a drink out of a fire hydrant. I get going and I just babble on as the brook, and at some point it's like, where's the valve? How do I turn this off?
It's all
Stop.
great. It's
Cognitive
all great
overload.
I'm loving it. But I would really love for people to be able to know how to find out more information about what you're doing. So any links or social media places you want to share?
Sure. They can find out more about Studio Resonate by simply going to studioresonate.com.
Mm-hmm.
And that will tell them more about Studio Resonate, and certainly they can find other links there to Pandora for Brands and Pandora in general. So on that side, they can see that. You can easily look me up on LinkedIn, follow me there. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, that's Audio Alchemist _. So the underscore is very important. So it's at Audio Alchemist, and then add an underscore at the end of that. And then if you want to Google, just Google Steve Keller, sonic branding, audio alchemy, whatever, you'll you'll come across a TEDx talk. TEDx talk that I did, and a few other things. So I'm easily searchable, and particularly interested in unique research and application that's being done out there. And because I'm learning all the time. I'm a student at heart, and I'm also fairly much an open book, because I do think by sharing knowledge, that's how we grow. And I feel like I'm entering a phase of my life and career where what I want to do is inspire younger people who are interested in this to dig deeper, to pick up with the knowledge that we have now, but to push the envelope and go even further than I could ever dream of going.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you so much for talking with me. Well, that's the end of this episode. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you heard, please take a moment to give the podcast a review. It's greatly appreciated and super helpful. Until next time.